So the first thing I was going to show you underneath of the truck here, right here, there's a fuel cooler. And you'll see these lines where they're all rusted out, leaking, all the way down here on the frame where they go in these little clamps. So what we're going to do is we're going to go up the frame until we find a spot that's nice and clean where we're going to put our couplings when we run our air brake tubing. We'll cut all this out of here. That's it's just a mess. We'll crawl out here and I'm going to show you. We had to cut the fuel lines. I don't know if you can see them or not, but you see up above here, it's real tight up in here where these couplings are at, like right up in here. These couplings. Here's another coupling. There's another coupling. Get out of here. I'll show you that. So what we did here was we just cut these off with a hacksaw because the tank's got a half a tank of fuel and it's siphoning it out all over me down there. So if you break the siphon by sawing off the lines, then you're not, at least you're not going to get a bath in diesel fuel. Catch what little bit's left there. So I'm going to show you our fuel sending unit for our 07 Duramax engine. My son bought this one off the internet for 50 bucks. If you go to GM, it's about 400. So if you remember these two lines right here, your two fuel lines, there's a quick couple that snaps onto these, and those two fuel lines are about $400 when you go to buy them. So the last three trucks that I've did, I'm going to show you how I did them, and I do it with air brake fittings, a 3/8 and a half-inch air brake fitting, and I use 3/8 and half-inch plastic air brake line. If you take the 3/8 air brake fitting, and you'll see there's an insert in here. So when you go to plastic, you have to leave it in there. When you go to steel, you take that insert out. So if you get a hold of it and you bend it back and forwards half a dozen times, it'll pull out of there. And that's the way you're going to put it on. So you're going to take your nut and then your ferrule and then your fitting. And you're going to start screwing that on there, and at the whole time you're putting that on there, you want to keep pushing that fitting towards that line so that it stays up on there as far as it possibly can. So I get a hold of it up here and hang on to it, and then take the fitting and tighten the fitting, holding up on it so that it stays on there as far as it'll possibly go. And that ferrule will crimp onto the end of that steel tube. And I really put a lot of squeeze on it. Once I get it good and tight, then I put quite a bit of squeeze on there to make sure I don't have any trouble with it. But if you get a truck that's leaking fuel when you fill the tank up, and I showed you that mess back there, some of that was brake fluid, but 90% of that mess was the diesel fuel running out of them hoses. And what it was doing was, it was, you know, when the truck's parked, it siphons. It just keeps siphoning out. So, you know, if you don't want to buy that $400 set of lines, when you hear them starting to squeak, you're getting pretty good and tight. So you see how that one went on there. And the half-inch will be exactly the same way. I'm going to take the insert out of it and put it on there exactly the same way. And then I'm going to run air brake tubing, plastic tubing, exactly the way they ran it in the factory on the truck. And I'm going to go up a little farther than normal. And I go all the way up until I find a piece of that steel tubing up there that looks like it's really good and clean. And I take a little tubing cutter like this, and I go up there and I roll that around and I cut that tubing off, and I do exactly the same thing with the opposite end. So when you're going to steel tube, you're going to take this insert and take this insert out of here just by grabbing hold of it, jiggling it until it pulls out. Now that one's ready for steel tube. Anything that goes into plastic, you have to leave that on there. So you got a plastic line, then you have your ferrule, and then you have your compression nut. And I'll tell you, it's a lot easier, you know, it's a lot easier than what you think. But if you take your time, you don't have to buy all that high dollar stuff. The only thing I ever ran into was this plug. Some of them, this plug was a different shape. So if you unplug yours and you see that it's an oval, make sure that the one that you buy is an oval. Otherwise, it's not going to work. You got to have exactly the same plug. Then on the factory, there's a little hose that goes from here to the vent on the fuel filler. And then this is another little vent that unplugs and snaps on here. You can reuse your old one. But your two fuel lines, you see how I did that. And it'll work, and it'll save you a lot of money. So there you go. So here's the fuel cooler we took out of the truck, and these fittings were completely rusted out. So we brought it up here on the workbench, and we got the fittings out, and they come with a barb on the end of them where you can change them to a rubber hose, I guess, but this is what we've got to put back on. And then what we did was we cut the ends of them off to shorten them up, because the ends of them are like 5/16, and then it goes to a 3/8 to use your air brake compression fittings again, both sides. So now we're getting ready to stick it back in the truck, and we've got most of our lines ran. The only thing we really have to do is just hook up the fuel to the fuel lines, and it'll be ready to go. So here's a look at the sending unit with the compression fittings already on it. And the new fuel lines, we put a little couple pieces of hose on there to kind of protect spots where they wanted to rub. We use almost all of the original fuel line holding brackets as they go down the frame and up towards the engine. I'll crawl underneath of that truck and I'll show you where they're going from here. With the compression fittings on it. Kind of hard to get underneath of this truck, I tell you. And here they're going down the frame rail. You see the original clamps there. And what we did here was we tried to find a piece that was clean to get those compression fittings on. So we pulled those lines away from that transmission a little bit and tied them up, and then tied the lines there. You see where they're tied there real good. But it'll work fine like that. Be good for another 300,000 miles.